You don't get to choose who deserves respect based on how much money you think they have, Sophie said, her voice steady but quiet enough that most of the room missed it, except for the man sitting alone in the corner booth who had been waiting all morning to hear something exactly like that. And his name was Darius Cole, though no one in this roadside diner on the edge of Route 41 had any reason to recognize it. Not in the worn gray hoodie, not with the scuffed sneakers dusted from miles of travel, not with the way he sat slightly hunched over a chipped ceramic mug like just another customer passing through. But Darius noticed everything. The way the neon sign flickered unevenly against the glass. The way the coffee tasted slightly burnt but still warm enough to comfort. And most of all, the way Sophie moved between tables with a kind of quiet efficiency that didn't beg for attention yet somehow held it anyway. She was in her mid-20s, blonde hair tied back in a loose ponytail that had started to fall apart by the lunch rush. Her uniform simple, slightly wrinkled, name tag tilted just enough to suggest she hadn't had a moment to fix it. And yet every time she approached a table, she brought with her something most places had long forgotten: sincerity, not the rehearsed kind that came from corporate scripts, but something softer, something real. Darius had seen enough to know the difference. He had built entire companies around reading people, understanding what they showed the world and what they kept hidden underneath. And this morning wasn't about food. It wasn't about coffee. It was about a question he had been asking himself more often than he cared to admit. What does integrity look like when no one is watching? Because power had a way of distorting every answer. People treated him differently the moment they knew who he was. Doors opened faster, voices softened. Respect came pre-packaged and hollow. And somewhere along the way it stopped meaning anything. So today he removed the suit, the watch, the presents, and stepped into a place where none of that mattered, or at least where it shouldn't. The bell above the door had chimed softly when he walked in. At 10:12 a.m., unnoticed, unremarkable, just another man looking for breakfast, and Sophie had been the one to greet him, not with excitement, not with judgment, just a simple good morning, paired with eye contact that didn't linger too long, but didn't avoid him either, balanced, human, and that alone had been enough to make him pause, because in a world that constantly calculated value, she didn't seem to be doing any math at all. But Darius wasn't here to be impressed by first impressions. He was here to test them, to see what held up under pressure, what cracked when pushed, because the truth about people never shows itself when things are easy. It reveals itself in the small moments, the inconvenient ones, the ones no one thinks matter. And as he sat there, fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table, watching Sophie handle a difficult customer 3 booths away without raising her voice or losing her composure, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not certainty. Not yet. But curiosity, sharp and focused, like the beginning of something that could go either way. And without looking up, without signaling anything beyond a quiet presence, Darius reached for the menu again, already planning his first move, because in the next few minutes, without ever announcing who he was going to find out exactly what kind of person Sophie Bennett really was, and more importantly, whether that kind of person still existed at all. The bell above the diner door chimed again, but this time Darius did not look up because his focus had already narrowed to a single moving point across the room. Sophie Bennett balancing 3 plates along her forearm while answering a question from a table of construction workers who spoke over each other like they were competing for air. She nodded, smiled, clarified the order without missing a beat, and then pivoted toward him as if she had never been interrupted at all, her pace unhurried, but never slow, the kind of rhythm that came from long shifts and no room for mistakes. She reached his booth with a notepad already in hand, even though she barely glanced at it. "Ready to order?" she asked, and her tone did not change. Not even slightly, no extra warmth, no dismissal either, just the same level ground she had given everyone else. And Darius noticed that immediately, because most people adjusted their tone based on what they thought they were dealing with. But Sophie did not seem to be measuring him at all, and that made the first move almost too easy. He leaned back slightly, scanning the menu as if he had not already memorized it, then said, "I will take the omelet, but I want the eggs cooked soft, not runny, not firm, somewhere in between, and I do not want any oil, only butter, but not too much butter, and the toast needs to be lightly browned, not crispy. And can you make sure the coffee is fresh, like actually fresh, not from that pot sitting there?" He gestured toward the counter without looking at it, his voice calm, but edged just enough to test patience. Not rude, not kind, intentionally inconvenient, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered across Sophie's face, not annoyance, not yet, just the recognition of a difficult order stacking itself higher than necessary, but it disappeared just as quickly as it came. Got it, she said, repeating each detail back to him without hesitation, her voice steady, her eyes meeting his briefly to confirm, not challenge, not submit, just to make sure she had it right. And then she added, "It might take a couple extra minutes to get it exactly how you want. Is that okay?" And there it was, the first point of friction handled without tension. She did not push back. She did not roll her eyes. She did not rush him. She simply told the truth and offered the choice back to him. And Darius nodded once, watching closely as she turned away and moved toward the kitchen, already calling out the order with the same clarity she had used at the table. No shortcuts, no complaints, just precision. And as she disappeared behind the swinging door, Darius exhaled slowly, his fingers resting against the edge of the mug again, because this was where most people started to slip, not in the moment of the request, but in what came after, the tone behind the scenes, the way they talked when they thought the customer could not hear, the subtle shift from professionalism to irritation. And he listened, not just with his ears but with the kind of attention that had once helped him read boardrooms full of executives twice his age. The kitchen noise rose and fell, orders overlapping, utensils clinking, a cook asking a question, another voice answering. And then Sophie again, repeating his order one more time, slower this time, making sure it was right, not mocking, not sarcastic, just careful, and something in that detail made Darius pause, because it was small, almost invisible, but it was real, and real things were rare, especially when no one was performing for an audience. He leaned back slightly, eyes drifting toward the window where sunlight cut across the parking lot in long, sharp lines. And for the first time since he walked in, he felt the test shift, not ending, not even close, but changing shape. Because Sophie Bennett had just passed the first layer without even realizing there was one, and that meant the next move would have to go deeper, not louder, not harsher, just more revealing. Because the truth about a person was never found in how they handled one difficult order, it was found in how they handled everything that came after it. The plate arrived exactly 8 minutes later, not rushed, not delayed, placed gently in front of him with a precision that suggested intention rather than habit. And Darius noticed immediately that every detail he had asked for had been followed. The eggs soft but not runny, the toast lightly browned, the coffee replaced with a fresh pour that still carried a faint curl of steam rising into the air. And Sophie did not hover as she set it down. She simply said, "Let me know if anything needs adjusting," before stepping back, giving space instead of waiting for approval. And that alone was unusual, because most people in her position either lingered too long or disappeared too quickly. But she seemed to understand the balance without needing to think about it. And Darius picked up his fork slowly, not to eat, but to continue the test, because the second layer was never about whether someone could follow instructions. It was about how they responded when those instructions were challenged. He took a small bite, paused, then set the fork down with a slight shift of expression, subtle but intentional. And when Sophie passed by again, he lifted his hand just enough to catch her attention. She turned immediately, not with urgency, but with awareness, and walked back over. "Is everything okay?" she asked. And there it was again, no assumption, no defensiveness, just a question that left room for truth. And Darius leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice, just enough to create tension without raising it. "It is close," he said, "but the eggs are a little too soft, and the toast could be a bit warmer, and I think the coffee might still be from the earlier batch." None of it was entirely true, but none of it was extreme either, just enough to create discomfort, just enough to test the line between patience and frustration. And for a brief moment the noise of the diner seemed to press in around them. Conversations overlapping, plates clinking, the low hum of midday traffic outside. But Sophie did not react to any of it. She looked down at the plate, then back at him, and nodded once, not quickly, not reluctantly, just acknowledging what he had said. "Okay," she replied. "I can fix that." And she reached for the plate without hesitation, not snatching it away, not sighing, not making a show of inconvenience, just taking responsibility for something she could have easily dismissed. And as she turned to head back toward the kitchen, a voice from the counter cut through the space, sharp and impatient, calling her name. A man in a pressed button-down shirt tapping his watch like time itself owed him something. And Darius followed her movement as she paused for half a second, just enough to register the competing demands, just enough to choose. And then she looked back at him. "I will get this corrected and right back to you," she said, before continuing toward the kitchen, leaving the other customer waiting, not ignored, not disrespected, just not prioritized over fairness. And that was when something shifted again, because most people under pressure started making calculations: who mattered more, who would tip better, who might complain louder. But Sophie did not seem to be doing any of that. She simply followed through on what she had already committed to, and Darius leaned back in the booth, watching the scene unfold with a sharper focus now, because the test was no longer hypothetical. It was real, layered, and moving. And as the man at the counter grew more visibly impatient, speaking louder, trying to pull attention back to himself, Darius realized that the next few minutes would not just reveal Sophie's professionalism. They would reveal her priorities, and priorities were where truth lived, not in words, not in appearances, but in the quiet decisions no one could fake for long. The man at the counter did not lower his voice this time. He raised it just enough to pull attention without appearing to shout, the kind of practiced impatience that expected immediate compliance. "I have been waiting 10 minutes, he said, tapping the surface again, his tone sharp with entitlement rather than urgency, and several heads turned, not fully, but enough to register the shift in energy. And Sophie stepped out from the kitchen with Darius's plate already being remade behind her, her hands empty for the first time since the rush began, and she paused between the counter and the dining floor, caught in that narrow space where expectation and choice collide. The man leaned forward slightly, pressing his advantage. "Are you going to help me or not?" And there it was, the moment most people avoided, the one that forced a decision that could not please everyone. And Darius watched closely from his booth, his expression unchanged but his attention absolute, because this was no longer about service. It was about alignment, about what Sophie believed mattered when pressure made everything louder. And she did not rush her answer. She did not apologize immediately. She did not deflect. Instead, she stepped closer to the counter, her posture straight but not rigid, her voice calm but clear. "I will be right with you," she said. "I am finishing up something for another customer first." And the man exhaled sharply, a short laugh that carried more disbelief than humor. "You are kidding, right?" he replied, glancing around as if expecting agreement. "I have places to be." And Sophie nodded once, acknowledging the statement without accepting the demand behind it. "I understand," she said, "and I will help you as soon as I am done." And she did not stay to argue. She did not escalate. She simply turned back toward the kitchen, choosing completion over convenience. And that was when the room shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the subtle way people recalibrated what they were seeing. A woman near the window stopped mid-conversation. A man at the far booth leaned slightly forward, and Darius felt something settle deeper this time. Not curiosity, not anymore, something closer to recognition, because he had seen this before, not in diners, not in small towns, but in boardrooms where decisions carried weight far beyond a single moment, and the rarest individuals were not the loudest or the most impressive. They were the ones who held their ground without needing to announce it. The ones who did not bend simply because pressure increased. And as Sophie moved behind the counter again, calling out to the cook with the same clarity as before, adjusting the order without blame, without frustration, Darius leaned back slightly, his gaze following her movements not as a test anymore, but as a study. Because the pattern was becoming clear, she did not perform fairness. She practiced it, consistently, quietly, without checking who was watching, and the man at the counter muttered something under his breath, stepping back just enough to signal irritation but not enough to leave. And the rest of the diner returned to its rhythm. Conversations resuming, plates moving, the hum of ordinary life continuing as if nothing had happened. But for Darius, everything had shifted, because the test he designed was no longer controlling the outcome. It was revealing something he had not expected to find so quickly. And as the corrected plate emerged from the kitchen once more, carried carefully in Sophie's hands, He realized the next move would not just challenge her patience or her professionalism. It would challenge the very boundary between obligation and belief, because what he needed to know now was not whether she could handle pressure, but whether she would stand by her choices when the cost of them became real. When Sophie returned to the booth the second time, the plate in her hands carried the same care as before, but now there was something quieter underneath it. Not tension, not hesitation, just a steadiness that had already made its decision long before this moment arrived. She set the dish down in front of Darius with the same deliberate precision, adjusting the angle slightly so it faced him directly. The steam rising again in thin, soft lines, and she did not rush away. She stayed just long enough to say, "I made sure it was exactly how you asked this time." And her tone was not defensive, not expectant, just clear, and Darius looked at the plate, then back at her, his eyes searching for something that had not appeared yet, any sign of irritation, any crack in the calm, but there was none, and before he could respond, a new voice entered the space behind her, deeper, sharper, carrying authority that did not need to announce itself loudly to be felt. "Sophie," it said, and she turned slightly, recognizing it instantly. The manager stood near the counter, arms folded, his presence cutting through the room with a different kind of pressure, the kind that came from inside the system rather than outside of it. And his gaze moved from her to Darius and back again, measuring, calculating. "We need you up front," he added, nodding toward the same man at the counter who had now begun speaking again, louder this time, drawing more attention with each word. "He is asking for priority service," the manager continued, his voice controlled but firm. "He is a regular." And the word hung there for a moment, not just as information but as instruction, and Sophie's eyes shifted briefly toward the counter, then back to the manager, and for the first time since Darius had been watching, there was a pause that held weight, not confusion, not fear, but the awareness of consequence. Because this was no longer about balancing customers. This was about choosing between expectation and principle, between keeping things smooth and keeping things fair. And Darius remained still, his fork untouched, his attention sharper than ever, because this was the line he had been waiting for, the one that separated habit from belief. And Sophie inhaled slowly, just enough to steady the moment, then spoke. "I am finishing up here," she said, her voice even, respectful, but unyielding in a way that did not challenge authority directly, yet did not bend to it either. And the manager's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in that familiar discomfort that came when control was not immediately returned. "He has been waiting," the manager replied, emphasizing the point as if repetition would shift the outcome, and Sophie nodded once, acknowledging it without conceding. "So has he," she said, gesturing lightly toward Darius without turning it into a confrontation, just stating a fact that existed whether it was convenient or not. And for a brief moment the space between them held still, the kind of silence that did not need volume to carry tension, and then the manager exhaled through his nose, a small controlled release that signaled the conversation was not over, just paused. "Do not make this difficult," he said, lowering his voice slightly, not for privacy but for emphasis, and Sophie met his gaze, not challenging, not avoiding, simply holding it long enough to make her position clear without needing to explain it further, and then she turned back to Darius. "Please try it, and let me know if it is better," she said, her attention returning fully to the task she had chosen to complete, and as she stepped away, moving toward the counter only after giving him that space, Darius felt something settle into place with a clarity that could not be mistaken, because this was no longer a test of service or patience. It was a test of alignment under pressure from every direction, and Sophie Bennett had just made a choice that most people avoided, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that carried more weight than any argument ever could. And as the manager turned back toward the counter, his posture tighter now, the room subtly aware of the shift, even if no one named it, Darius finally picked up his fork. Not because the food mattered, but because the outcome of this moment already did. The fork moved slowly this time, not because the food required hesitation, but because Darius no longer needed to rush the outcome. He took a bite, measured it without expression, then another, and the difference was undeniable. The eggs were exactly as requested, the balance precise, the kind of detail that could only come from someone who listened fully the first time and cared enough to correct it the second. And he set the fork down again, not to complain, not to test further in the same way, but because the test had already shifted beyond the plate in front of him. And across the room, Sophie now stood at the counter facing the waiting customer, her posture unchanged, her tone steady as she addressed him. "Thank you for waiting," she said, and the man exhaled sharply as if the words themselves were not enough to compensate for the time. "I should not have to wait this long," he replied, louder than necessary. His frustration no longer contained, but not uncontrolled either, the kind that expected immediate correction simply because it existed, and Sophie nodded once, acknowledging again without absorbing the tone. "I understand," she said. "What can I get started for you?" And there was no apology layered in excess, no attempt to overcompensate, just the same level ground she had offered everyone else. And the man leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice now as if to make the point more personal. "Next time, you might want to recognize who has been coming here for years," he said, his words carrying the implication more than the statement itself. And Sophie paused for just a fraction of a second, not to reconsider, but to choose her response carefully. "I do appreciate that," she replied. "And I also make sure every customer is taken care of fairly." And the word fairly settled into the space between them with more weight than volume, and the man did not respond immediately, his expression tightening, as if searching for a way to push back without escalating further. But there was nothing to argue with, because she had not dismissed him, she had not challenged him, she had simply refused to place him above someone else without reason. And behind her the manager watched, his arms no longer folded but his stance still firm, observing the exchange with attention that had not yet resolved. And Darius remained still in his booth, his eyes following every movement, every word, because this was the moment where most people softened their position, where they adjusted just enough to avoid friction. But Sophie did not shift. She continued taking the order, writing it down, with the same attention she had given before, repeating it back clearly. And then she said, "I will get this started right away," before turning toward the kitchen once more, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward in the same rhythm she had maintained from the beginning. And something in that consistency landed differently now, because it was no longer about handling one situation correctly. It was about maintaining the same standard across all of them, regardless of pressure, regardless of expectation, regardless of who was standing in front of her. And Darius leaned back slightly, his gaze softening in a way that had nothing to do with the room and everything to do with what he had just witnessed, because for the first time in a long time, the test he designed had not exposed weakness. It had revealed strength, quiet, unshaken, and entirely real. And as the noise of the diner continued around him, unchanged and unaware, he realized that the next move would not be about pushing her further. It would be about understanding what kind of person could hold that line without needing recognition, because that kind of person was not common. And when you found it, you did not test it endlessly, you learned from it. For a moment, nothing in the diner seemed to change. The same hum of conversation, the same clatter of plates, the same steady rhythm of a place that had seen thousands of ordinary mornings pass without consequence. But inside Darius, something had shifted in a way that did not announce itself outwardly. He remained seated, posture relaxed, eyes calm, yet his attention was no longer searching for flaws. It was tracing something far more rare, consistency, without performance. And as he watched Sophie move from the counter back toward the kitchen, taking another order, delivering another plate, offering the same level tone to each person regardless of how they spoke to her, he felt a memory surface, not sharply, not painfully, but with a quiet weight that carried years behind it. He was 26 again, standing in a glass-walled office in downtown Chicago, dressed in a tailored suit that had cost more than most people in that building would assume he could afford. And still the man across the table had not looked at him as an equal, had not heard his proposal as something worth considering, only as something to dismiss. "We are looking for a different kind of profile," the man had said, smiling politely as if that made the sentence less final. And Darius had nodded then, just like Sophie had nodded now, not because he agreed, but because he understood what was happening beneath the words. And he remembered walking out of that building with a calm expression and a mind already recalibrating, not angry, not loud, just certain that he would build something no one could dismiss again. And years later, he had done exactly that. Companies, investments, influence that stretched far beyond rooms like that one. But somewhere along the way, the clarity of those early moments had been replaced by something else, something filtered. People who adjusted themselves the moment they recognized his name, who treated him not as a person but as a position. And that was why he sat here now, in a diner off a quiet highway, wearing clothes that erased his identity on purpose, because he needed to see what remained when none of that mattered. And as Sophie returned to his table once more, not to check the food immediately, but to refill his coffee without asking, noticing the level had dropped below halfway, he realized that she was not responding to him as a category. She was responding to him as a person, the same way she had responded to every other person in the room. And that distinction carried more weight than any recognition ever could. "Everything tasting better now?" she asked, her tone unchanged, her expression open but not expectant. And Darius looked at her for a moment longer than before, not evaluating, not testing, just seeing. "Yes," he said simply, and it was the first completely honest answer he had given since he walked in, and Sophie nodded once, accepting it without needing anything more, then stepped away again to continue her work, and as she did, Darius leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the window once more, the sunlight now higher, casting sharper lines across the pavement outside, and, for the first time since the morning began, the question that had brought him here felt different, not unresolved, not incomplete, but answered in a way he had not expected, because the test he designed had not just revealed her character, it had reminded him of something he had nearly lost sight of. That respect, real respect, was not something given to power. It was something practiced in moments where power was invisible. And as the realization settled in, quiet but certain, Darius reached into his pocket, not hurriedly, not dramatically, just enough to feel the weight of what came next, because the test was over now, and what followed would not be about proving anything. It would be about acknowledging what had already been proven without words. Darius did not stand immediately. He let the moment breathe just long enough for the room to remain what it had been all morning, ordinary, unremarkable, untouched by the weight of what was about to shift. And then he reached into his pocket and placed a small black card on the edge of the table, not sliding it forward, not presenting it, just letting it exist there as quietly as everything else he had done. And when Sophie returned a minute later with the check tucked neatly in a black folder, she did not notice it at first. Her attention focused on the routine she had repeated hundreds of times before. "No rush," she said, placing the folder down with the same calm tone. "I will take it whenever you are ready." And Darius nodded once, then gently turned the card toward her, and something in the motion made her pause, not dramatically, just enough to register that this was different from the usual exchange. Her eyes dropped to the card, then back to him, and then back again. And the shift in her expression was subtle but undeniable, not shock, not disbelief, just the quiet recognition that the man sitting in front of her did not belong to the category she had placed him in, not because of appearance, but because of what the name on that card carried beyond this room. And she did not react outwardly. She did not step back or change her tone. She simply looked at him again, this time with a layer of understanding added to what had already been there. And Darius met her gaze without altering his posture. "I wanted to see something," he said, his voice still calm, still measured, but now carrying a clarity that had not been necessary before. And Sophie did not interrupt. She did not ask questions. She simply listened. "Most places change depending on who walks in," he continued. "And most people change depending on who they think they are talking to." And he let the sentence settle for a moment, not as a criticism, not as an accusation, but as a truth that did not need decoration. "You did not," he added. And across the room the manager had begun to notice the stillness at the table, the pause that did not match the flow of the diner, his attention shifting toward them. But he did not step in yet, not until he saw Sophie holding the card, her posture slightly different now, more grounded, more aware of what this moment represented. And Darius continued, "You treated me the same when I looked. Like I did not matter as you did when you realized I might." And Sophie exhaled softly, not from pressure, but from the weight of understanding what he was saying. And she shook her head slightly, not in denial, but in quiet clarity. "I treated you the same because you do matter." she said, and her voice did not rise. It did not change. It simply held the same steady tone it had carried all morning. And for the first time since he had walked in, Darius allowed a small shift in his expression. Not a smile, not fully, but something close to it, something that acknowledged the answer had gone beyond what he expected, and behind her the manager stepped closer now, drawn by the tension he could not yet define, his eyes moving from Sophie to the card, and then to Darius, trying to place what he was seeing into something familiar. But Darius did not look at him. Not yet. His attention remained on Sophie, because this moment was not about authority or correction. It was about recognition. "Do you plan to stay here long?" he asked, not as a casual question, but as something more deliberate. And Sophie hesitated for the first time, not because she did not know the answer, but because she understood the weight behind the question. "I have not really thought that far ahead," she said honestly, and Darius nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something rather than left it open, and he reached for the check, placing his card inside without breaking the calm of the moment, because what came next was not about proving who he was. It was about what he chose to do with what he had just seen. And the room around them continued as it always had, unaware that in one quiet corner, something far more significant than a simple meal had just unfolded. The manager stepped closer now, close enough to see the name on the card clearly, and whatever assumption he had been forming dissolved almost instantly, his posture shifting in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of shift that came when someone realized they had been standing in the wrong position without knowing it. "Sir, I did not realize," he began, his tone already adjusting, softer, more careful. But Darius raised his hand slightly, not to interrupt with authority, but to stop the direction of the conversation before it could change into something else entirely. "That is exactly the point," he said, his voice still calm, still even, and the manager paused, uncertain now, caught between reacting to the name he recognized and the moment he had not fully understood, and Darius stood slowly from the booth, not rushing, not commanding attention, but the movement alone drew eyes from nearby tables. A quiet awareness spreading without a single word being raised, and he turned slightly toward the manager, then toward Sophie, keeping his focus where it belonged. "Nothing should have changed," he continued, not as a reprimand, but as a statement of principle. And the manager nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Of course, absolutely," he said, but the words felt lighter than the moment, as if they were trying to catch up rather than lead, and Darius did not press him further, because this was not about correction, it was about contrast, and the contrast had already revealed itself. He reached for the check folder, closed it gently, and placed it back on the table, the action simple, final, and Sophie remained where she stood, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression steady, not overwhelmed, not intimidated, just present. And that steadiness held his attention more than anything else in the room. "You did not pass a test," Darius said, looking at her directly now. "You reminded me of something I should not have needed to test in the first place." And Sophie tilted her head slightly, not confused, but thoughtful, as if she understood the weight behind the words without needing them explained further, and for a brief moment the room seemed to quiet around them, not completely, but enough that the space between them felt separate from everything else. "People think respect is something you earn from status," Darius added. "But what you showed is that it is something you give without needing a reason." And Sophie gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement. Because to her it had never been a principle to declare, it had simply been the way she moved through the world, and Darius reached into his pocket once more, this time pulling out a second card, placing it on the table beside the first, not sliding it forward, not presenting it as an offer to be taken, just leaving it there as an option. "If you ever decide you want to do something different," he said, his tone unchanged, "call that number." And he did not elaborate, did not explain what it meant, because the opportunity itself was not the point, the recognition was. And Sophie looked at the card briefly, then back at him, and for the first time there was a faint shift in her expression, not excitement, not disbelief, but something quieter, something that suggested possibility had just entered a space where it had not been expected, and Darius nodded once, as if that was enough, as if everything that needed to be said had already been said without being spoken directly, and he turned toward the door, walking at the same measured pace he had entered with. No urgency, no need to look back, because the moment did not require confirmation. It was complete on its own, and as the bell above the door chimed again, letting in a brief wash of daylight before settling back into place, the diner returned to its rhythm. The conversations resumed, the plates moved, the ordinary flow continued. But something had shifted in a way that would not fade as quickly as the sound of that door, and Sophie stood there for a second longer than usual before picking up the check folder, opening it to finish the routine she had started, her movement steady, unchanged, because that was who she was. Not someone who adjusted when the world revealed something unexpected, but someone who remained the same regardless of it. And outside, Darius paused for just a moment beside